Nobody's coming to help you, sweetheart. So why don't you tell us what you're really doing here? The words landed in the cold morning air like something that had been rehearsed, the kind of line a man says when he has already decided how the scene ends and is simply waiting for the other person to accept their role in it. The woman they were spoken to did not flinch, and she did not answer, not immediately, not in the way they expected, because what Officer Brett Langley and Sergeant Dale Pruitt were waiting for was either tears or defiance. Either the soft collapse of someone who had been broken before, or the hard resistance of someone they could write up afterward. And what they got instead was something they had no training for, which was absolute stillness. She was pressed against the hood of a department cruiser, her cheek against cold metal. Both wrists wrenched behind her back with a force that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the specific enjoyment some men take in reminding certain people where they stand. And she was still, and she was breathing, and her eyes were open and focused on a point in the middle distance as if she were doing math. Langley was tall, red-faced, close-cropped platinum blonde hair that caught the November morning light in a way that would photograph very clearly, and he had the kind of jaw that belonged to a man who had never once in his adult life been made to answer for anything. And right now that jaw was close to her ear, and his breath was warm and certain, and he was waiting. Pruitt stood to her left, stocky and pale-eyed, his knee pressed into the back of her thigh, one hand gripping her shoulder with a steadiness that suggested he had done this before and had never been asked to explain it. And he was also waiting, and the two of them together radiated the specific confidence of men who understood the territory they were operating in, and had been told explicitly that this morning it was theirs. Her briefcase lay open on the asphalt 7 feet away, where it had landed when Langley yanked her arm up, and its contents had scattered across the pavement in the way that personal belongings scatter when someone who carries them with dignity is suddenly and violently deprived of it. And among those scattered contents face up on the dark asphalt, catching the light from the same angle as Langley's hair, was a document, and that document bore a city seal, and below the seal was a name, and below the name was a title, and the title was Chief of Police, and the date on the document was today. Neither officer had looked at it. She counted to 3 inside the architecture of her own breathing. 1, 2, 3. The way she had learned to count a very long time ago in rooms far more dangerous than this parking lot. And then she said in a voice so quiet and so precisely controlled that Langley had to lift his head to be certain he had heard her correctly. "I'd like you to release my wrists now, Officer Langley, and then I'd like you to read what's on the ground beside my briefcase, and I'd suggest you do it in that order." The use of his name stopped him in the way that a specific sound stops an animal in the dark. That sudden biological recalibration when the environment reveals it knows more than you do, and his grip did not loosen yet. But something in the architecture of his certainty developed its first crack hairline thin, invisible to everyone except the woman whose cheekbone it was that had been pressed against metal, and who had been counting on exactly this. This is the story of what happened next, and what had been quietly and methodically put in place long before anyone arrived in that parking lot, and what it costs a black woman to be that prepared, and what it costs the people who mistake that preparation for weakness. Her name was Adriana Cole, and she was 52 years old, and she had been in law enforcement for 28 years. And in those 28 years, she had cleaned out 3 departments in 3 cities, and had done it each time without leaking a single detail in advance, moving her pieces into position the way a surgeon works, which is to say without drama, without announcement, with nothing but precision and the willingness to do the unglamorous work that actual change requires. She was not flashy in the way that people who want you to know how powerful they are tend to be flashy. She drove herself, carried her own bag, wore clothes selected for competence rather than impression, and had a way of sitting in a room that made people underestimate her for approximately as long as it took her to start talking, at which point they generally stopped underestimating her and began to understand that the conversation they were in had been structured by her before it started. Mayor Raymond Osei Harlow. City's first black mayor had signed her appointment papers on a quiet Thursday in late October, and his communications director had advised him against a big announcement, had suggested they let her get settled first. Let the department get used to the idea before they fully understood who she was, and Osei had been in politics long enough to recognize bad advice when he heard it, and he had taken it anyway because sometimes the politics of a moment demand a kind of caution that is indistinguishable from cowardice, and he would reckon with that choice later. The press release had gone out at 4:47 on a Friday afternoon, a single paragraph and a stock photo, and by the following Monday, most of the rank and file officers at Harlow City PD still hadn't fully absorbed the fact that their new commanding officer was a 52-year-old black woman with 28 years in the field, 2 master's degrees, and a record of dismantling corrupt command structures so thorough that the officers who survived her tenure in previous departments spoke about it the way soldiers speak about a particular battle, with a complicated mixture of respect and residual adrenaline. She had done her homework on Harlow City the way she always did her homework, which was the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, before making the first cut methodically, without emotion, with the specific clinical precision of someone who understands that the gap between what she finds and what she expected to find is itself a form of data. She knew about the civil rights lawsuits. She knew about the pattern of use of force complaints that had been filed and had gone nowhere for years. She knew about Deputy Chief Grant Holloway, who had been running the department for 9 months on an interim basis, and who had sent 4 letters to the mayor's office suggesting with escalating boldness that an internal candidate should be elevated, and she knew that Holloway had already told his lieutenants that the position was as good as his. Her credentials badge was in her inner jacket pocket, and her department-issued ID had not yet been processed. The HR paperwork that should have been completed over the weekend had inexplicably not been touched, and she would learn later without surprise that this had not been an accident. She parked in the visitor section because she did not want to start her first morning with a parking dispute, and she was 40 feet from the front door when she heard boots behind her moving fast. Harlow City PD had a long shadow, and the shadow had a shape, and the shape was familiar to anyone who had spent time studying what happens inside institutions when the people at the top decide that loyalty to the structure matters more than accountability to the people the structure is supposed to serve. There had been lawsuits, civil rights complaints filed by families who had believed in the process enough to go through it and who had gotten back a silence so thorough it felt like a second injury, and then settlements buried in budget lines that described the payouts as equipment maintenance or facility upgrades. Language designed not to conceal the money, but to prevent the money from telling a story that connected one incident to another, because the incidents were not separate. They were chapters, and the people who had been running the department for a long time had been very careful to make sure no one read them in sequence. Deputy Chief Grant Holloway was 59 years old, 6'2", with silver blonde hair worn swept back in the manner of a man who understood how authority presents itself, and he had spent 3 decades inside Harlow City PD building something that looked from the outside like a career, and looked from the inside like a kingdom. And the specific pleasure of that kingdom was the pleasure of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything by anyone who outranked him. Because for his entire career, the person who outranked him had either been a friend or a fool, or both. He had run the department for 9 months since the previous chief's retirement, and he had run it as if the permanent appointment were a formality, and he had genuinely, with the specific self-assurance of powerful men who have spent too long in unchallenged territory, believed that it was. And when the mayor's office had called him to say that an external candidate had been selected, Holloway had spent approximately 90 seconds being polite about it, and then had called his 3 most trusted lieutenants and said with a calmness that his lieutenants would later describe as chilling that he was not going to make this easy. He had 4 letters on record with the mayor's office, each one more presumptuous than the last. The final one, essentially arguing that an outsider appointment would damage morale so severely that the department could not be held responsible for its own dysfunction, which was a threat dressed in the language of concern and which Mayor Osei had read carefully and then set aside in the manner of a man who has catalogued a piece of information that he intends to return to when the time is right. Holloway's choice to delay Adriana's credential processing was not accidental, and the two officers he placed near the entrance to the parking lot that morning were not there because of a coincidence in scheduling and the specific instruction he had given them that she would be arriving without her official department ID, that anything she showed them could be characterized as insufficient, and that they had a brief window to establish the tone was an instruction he gave with the confidence of a man who had been establishing tones for 30 years without consequence. Brett Langley had been on the force for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had accumulated 4 use-of-force complaints and 0 repercussions, and the absence of repercussions had done to his character what the absence of friction does to any moving object, which is to say, it had accelerated certain tendencies that might otherwise have been slowed, and the tendency that had accelerated most dramatically in Langley's case was the tendency to treat the authority of his badge as something personal, something he wore on his personality rather than his chest, something that meant the space around him belonged to him in a way that justified responses that no formal training had ever sanctioned. He was the one who grabbed her first, and he was the one who spoke in her ear, and he would be, when the footage played at the disciplinary hearing 3 weeks later, the face that the room watched most closely, not because he was the worst of what was wrong with Harlow City PD, but because he was the most visible, and visibility in a moment of documented wrongdoing carries a weight that internal culture cannot protect you from, no matter how many times it has protected you before. Dale Pruitt had been on the force for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had accumulated 11 use-of-force complaints and, like Langley, 0 repercussions. And the specific thing about Pruitt's file that Adriana had noted when she reviewed it weeks earlier from her apartment in Cincinnati was not the number of complaints, though the number was notable, but the consistency of the language across the reports. The way certain phrases recurred in the incident descriptions in a way that suggested the reports had been written with a template, and that the template had been provided by someone above him who was invested in the outcomes, and that the investment had been consistent and institutional and had protected him every single time. She had read his name before she ever set foot in Harlow City, and when she turned around in the parking lot and saw the name on his badge, she felt not surprise, but a specific kind of recognition. The recognition of a person who has been doing a job long enough to know what the evidence was always going to show long before the evidence showed it. While Adriana was walking from her parked car to the front entrance of Harlow City PD headquarters, 4 things were simultaneously in motion that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with 28 years of understanding that a black woman who enters a hostile institution without preparing for hostility is not being brave. She is being careless. And Adriana Cole had never in her professional life been careless. Her attorney, Simone Adeyemi, was parked on a side street 2 blocks from the department, and in Simone's possession was a camera footage preservation request that she had already filed electronically with the city's IT department, time-stamped and confirmed, meaning that whatever the parking lot cameras had captured in the last 30 minutes was already legally locked, already beyond the reach of anyone who might later wish it had never existed. Mayor Osei's chief of staff had been alerted by text message the moment Adriana pulled into the visitor parking section, and was already in contact with the city legal team, and had a second text drafted and ready to send the moment anything irregular was confirmed. A journalist named Carol Voss from the Harlow City Tribune was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from the department with a long lens pointed at the parking lot, having been tipped off anonymously the previous Friday about what might happen on Monday morning, and she had arrived at 7:15 a.m. and had been there for 45 minutes and had already checked her camera settings twice and had her recorder running on the table beside her coffee in case anything happened that needed audio. And quietly, weeks before any of this, the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been briefed not officially, not with subpoenas or formal case designations, but briefed in the specific, careful way that federal investigators agree to receive information they are not yet ready to act on, but want to know. Exists about financial irregularities buried in the city's settlement accounts, irregularities that pointed toward a pattern of payments that had been designed to resolve incidents without creating the paper trail that connected them. Adriana had not staged the parking lot, and she had not wanted it to happen, and the bruise that was already forming on her cheekbone was real, and it hurt, but she had been ready for it in the way she had spent her entire professional life being ready for it, which was the specific and exhausting readiness of a black woman who understands that every room she enters professionally is a room in which she may have to prove something her colleagues were never asked to prove, and who has decided that the proof when demanded will be so overwhelming that demanding it will become the thing that ends the person who demanded it. The precise documented time-stamped moment that would define the rest of Brett Langley's professional life and haunt him as these moments do in the specific recurring way of something irreversible was 7:42 and 14 seconds on a Monday morning in November when he grabbed her arm. Not because she had run, not because she had raised her voice or reached for anything or given him any of the cues that formal training identifies as justifying a physical response, but because she had said calmly and without theater that she would need to reach inside her blazer to show her credentials, and the combination of her calmness and her blackness and the specific instructions he had been given 14 minutes earlier by a man with silver blonde hair and 3 decades of uncontested authority had created in Brett Langley's mind a certainty so complete that it left no room for the question that should have been the first question, which was whether this was someone he was authorized to touch at all. He grabbed her arm and yanked it upward and behind her back with a force that the department's own use of force guidelines would later classify in the language of disciplinary proceedings as significantly excessive for a subject who had displayed no resistance, no threat, and no physical aggression of any kind. And the force was not accidental. It was not a miscalculation of distance or pressure. It was intentional in the way that only force deployed from a position of certainty is intentional, the intentionality of a man who does not expect to be questioned. The briefcase left her hand when her arm was pulled, and it hit the asphalt with a sound that she would remember afterward not as loud but as sharp a crack that split the morning open and its contents scattered across the pavement in the cold air. And she felt the cold air on her face, because Pruitt came in from her left and shoved her, not a controlled redirect, not a firm escort, but a shove with the weight of his chest behind it, and her cheek made contact with the hood of a parked cruiser, and the metal was cold in the way that only outdoor metal in November is cold, with a kind of settled indifference, and she could feel the ridged edge of the hood pressing into her cheekbone. She did not fight, and she did not scream, and she did not go limp in the way of someone who has given up. She went still in the way of someone who has made a decision, and she breathed, and she counted. 1, 2, 3. Feeling Pruitt's knee press into the back of her thigh. Feeling Langley wrench both wrists behind her with his full grip. Feeling the cold of the hood, and hearing the ordinary sounds of the city continuing around her. The distant sound of traffic on the main road, the mechanical click of a parking structure gate somewhere nearby. The sound of November morning proceeding as if nothing was happening in this lot that did not happen every day. Langley leaned down close to her ear, and this was the moment, this was the thing that would matter most when the footage was played in every disciplinary hearing and on every news broadcast. This specific lean, this specific proximity, this specific register of a man who believes he is alone with his certainty. And he said in a voice loud enough to be clearly captured by the lot's audio-enhanced cameras, loud enough to confirm beyond any procedural challenge that the statement was deliberate and not accidental. "Nobody's coming to help you, sweetheart, so why don't you tell us what you're really doing here?" She counted to 3 and said quietly and precisely, "I'd like you to release my wrists now, Officer Langley." His grip loosened by a fraction. The fraction that happens when a specific sound reaches a specific part of the brain that has not yet caught up to the rest of the performance. And she felt it, and she continued. "And then I'd like you to look at the document that is currently lying on the ground beside my briefcase. 30 feet from where all of this was happening, in the back seat of a silver sedan parked in the employee section of the lot, a 9-year-old girl named Nadia Monroe was eating a breakfast bar and looking out the window at the cold morning with the particular unfocused attention of a child who is being driven somewhere she has been driven before and is not expecting to see anything worth looking at. Her mother, Keisha Monroe, was a civilian records administrator at the department, and she drove this route every Monday morning and parked in this section every Monday morning, and had spent years developing the specific practiced normalcy of a person who works inside an institution, whose culture they understand well enough to navigate and not well enough to change. And she had been reaching for the door handle when she stopped, because what was happening 30 feet away was not something that fit into the practiced normalcy she had spent years developing. Nadia was the one who spoke first. She had put down the breakfast bar and pressed both hands flat against the cold glass of the car window, and was watching the two officers with the focused, uncomplicated attention of a child who has not yet learned the particular adult skill of deciding not to see what is directly in front of her. And she said to her mother in the matter-of-fact tone that children use for things they have already decided are simply true, Mama. Why are they doing that? She wasn't doing anything wrong. Keisha's hand was still on the door handle, and she held it there for a long moment without moving, and what was happening inside her in that moment was something that required no narration, because anyone who has ever sat inside an institution and watched something wrong happen and weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of silence already knows exactly what it felt like. And Nadia did not know any of that. She only knew what she could see, which was a woman in a charcoal blazer being held against a police car by two large men, and it did not look right. And she said so. And her mother said very quietly, "I know, baby." Nadia kept both hands on the glass until the woman straightened and placed something on the hood of the car, and one of the officers stepped back, and she watched the woman pick up her briefcase and walk toward the building without hurrying, and the officers stood in the parking lot without moving, and Nadia, with the directness that 9-year-olds have not yet learned to suppress, said, "Is she going to be okay?" And Keisha, watching the woman disappear through the front door of the department headquarters, said, "Yes." And then, after a pause that held a great deal more than the word that came out of it, she said, "I think she's going to be more than okay." She asked them once more to release her wrists, and the second time she asked it the way a person asks when they already know the answer will be yes, because they have changed the conditions under which the answer will be given. And Langley's hands came away from her wrists with the specific reluctance of a man who is already trying to recalculate, and she straightened slowly and without drama, and reached inside her blazer with the deliberateness of someone who has thought about this exact moment and prepared for the exact interpretation that will be placed on every physical action she takes. She withdrew a folded document, and she placed it flat on the hood of the cruiser, smoothing it with the heel of her hand, the way you smooth something. You want people to read clearly, and she stepped back and she said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The document had a city seal at the top embossed and official, and below the seal was the full letterhead of the city of Harlow. And below that, in 14-point font, the appointment of Adriana Cole as Chief of Police, Harlow City Police Department. Effective November 4th. Today's date this morning, this exact moment in time. And below that were two signatures in blue ink, Mayor Raymond Osei's, in the deliberate hand of a man who understood the weight of what he was signing, and City Council Chair Patricia Howell's countersignature below it, and at the bottom the city's official seal pressed so firmly into the paper that you could feel it with your thumb from the back. Langley read it once, and then he read it again, and the thing that happened to his face during the second reading was a thing that Carol Voss, sitting in the coffee shop across the street with her long lens, would later describe as the clearest photograph she had ever taken in 14 years of journalism, because every layer of what had just happened moved across his features in sequence. The white of incomprehension, the red of exposure, the gray of something that has no name, but that every person who has ever been completely and publicly wrong about something they were absolutely certain of will recognize immediately. Pruitt said nothing, and his silence was its own document, and he looked at the appointment letter. The way a man looks at something that has irrevocably ended a version of his life, the version in which the thing he just did was going to be fine. Adriana retrieved her briefcase from the asphalt, checked the clasp intact, straightened her blazer with 2 small, precise adjustments, and touched her cheekbone once with the tips of 2 fingers briefly, the way you check something you already know the answer to, and pulled her fingers away clean. No blood, though the bruise would be visible by afternoon and dark by evening, and would take 11 days to fade completely. She read both name tags one final time, confirming what she had already committed to memory, and then she walked past them and through the front door of the Harlow City Police Department headquarters and into the building she now commanded. Neither officer moved for a full 11 seconds after the door closed behind her. The cameras caught that too. The lobby of Harlow City PD headquarters smelled like burnt coffee and aging carpet, and the specific institutional air of a building that has been running the same way for a very long time and has stopped noticing the smell of itself. And behind the front desk, a heavyset man named Corporal Eddie Voss looked up from his monitor when the door opened and said with the casual authority of someone whose job it is to process visitors all day, "Can I help you find someone?" She said, "I'm your new chief." "Where is Deputy Chief Holloway?" Eddie's mouth opened and then closed, and then he looked at his screen, and then at her, and then back at his screen with the expression of a man who is hoping very much that the technology in front of him is going to provide some clarity that the situation itself is not currently offering, and the technology, as it so often does in moments requiring human resolution, offered nothing. "He's in the 3rd floor conference room," Eddie said finally. "Command staff meeting." "Thank you, Corporal Voss," Adriana said and walked to the elevator. People in the hallways watched her move through the building with the specific attention of people who can feel that something is changing but cannot yet name what it is. The same feeling as pressure dropping before weather, and she moved through their attention without acknowledging it, not because she was unaware of it, but because she had spent 28 years learning to move through rooms that were not ready for her, and had developed a quality of forward motion that was so unself-conscious it had the effect of making the room adjust rather than making her pause. Grant Holloway was 59 years old, and he had spent 3 decades being the largest personality in every room he entered, and he looked up from the head of the conference table expecting his assistant, and saw instead a woman he recognized from the photograph in the press release, and something in the specific quality of the way she walked through the door told him in the part of his brain that had survived this long by reading rooms accurately that the morning had not gone the way he planned. She set her briefcase on the table. She withdrew the appointment letter. She slid it to the center without drama and without preamble, the way you place a card that ends a game, and she said that she would be beginning the transition immediately, and that she needed the external lot camera footage from this morning, specifically the north quadrant, the last 20 minutes, and that the footage was to be treated as subject to an official evidence preservation order effective immediately, not to be deleted, copied, transferred, or modified, and that this order was being issued by the Chief of Police of Harlow City, which was the person standing in front of him. The room was silent for approximately 4 seconds, and then Holloway smiled the smile of a man who has been smiling in difficult rooms for a long time, a smile that had the surface geometry of warmth and the internal architecture of something that had not been warm in years. And, he said, "Welcome to Harlow City, Chief Cole. We've been expecting you." The lie sat in the room like smoke from something that burned a long time ago and never fully cleared. To understand why the parking lot happened, you had to go back 3 years to a Thursday evening in September when a 23-year-old man named Jalen Ross was stopped on Mercer Street by Officer Brett Langley and his patrol partner for what the incident report described as a broken tail light and ended up in Harlow City General Hospital with 2 broken ribs, a fractured eye socket, and kidney damage that required surgery and left him with a cane he would still be using 3 years later. Jalen was black. He had been unarmed. He had been alone. There were no witnesses who stepped forward. The dash cam on Langley's cruiser had, according to the filed report, experienced a technical malfunction that began approximately 4 minutes before the stop and resolved approximately 7 minutes after Jalen was transported to the hospital. A window of malfunction so precisely and conveniently timed that Simone Adeyemi, who took the case, had described it to her paralegal as the most expensive coincidence she had ever encountered in civil litigation. The city settled the lawsuit for $290,000, and the settlement was buried in a quarterly budget line labeled infrastructure maintenance, and the 2 officers involved received a formal review that concluded there was insufficient evidence to recommend disciplinary action. A conclusion that Holloway had overseen personally and that had been reached through a process of investigation so brief and so procedurally thin that it would later be described by a state investigator as a performance of accountability rather than the practice of it. Simone Adeyemi had not forgotten, and she had not moved on, and over the 2 years following the settlement, she had assembled a file with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the only reliable way to dismantle something built from corruption is to build something more durable from truth. And when Mayor Osei announced his national search for a new chief, she had arranged a private meeting with his transition team, and she had brought the file and she had placed it on the table, and 4 weeks later, Adriana Cole had received a phone call in Cincinnati. Sergeant Paul Denton had been with Harlow City PD for 20 years, and he had attended Holloway's daughter's wedding as a guest and had covered for officers he knew were wrong, because the culture inside that building had made silence feel like a form of survival. The way certain climates make heavy clothing feel necessary even in summer, and he had been doing it for so long that he had almost stopped noticing the weight of it. And then Jalen Ross's mother had come to his church on a Sunday morning in the spring, and she had sat 3 rows in front of him. And when the pastor asked the congregation to name their burdens, she had said quietly and without drama that her son had been hurt by officers who were never made to answer for it. And she said it the way people say things. They have said many times in many places and have stopped expecting to be heard. And Paul Denton had sat in his pew and had felt something break open in him that could not be closed again. And he had gone home that afternoon and sat in his kitchen for 2 hours, and then he had called Simone Adeyemi's office. He had been recording every relevant conversation since discreetly legally with the specific care of a man who understood that the thing he was doing required documentation to be real, and the letter he had sent to the mayor's office sealed, signed, dated, had been sitting in a safe for 3 weeks. On the morning Adriana arrived, Denton had been standing near the coffee station on the 2nd floor when he saw through the window that overlooked the north section of the parking lot what was happening to the new chief. And he had stood there and watched. And then he had set down his cup and he had gone back to his desk, not to hide and not to pretend, but because he had already done the part that mattered most, and because the rest of it was already in motion, and because he trusted for the first time in a long time that what he had set in motion was pointed in the right direction. By 12:30 p.m. on that Monday, Grant Holloway had placed a call to his personal attorney, and the conversation that followed was the kind of conversation that personal attorneys try to keep short because brevity signals severity, and this one was very short, by 2 p.m. Both Brett Langley and Dale Pruitt had been formally placed on administrative leave pending a use-of-force investigation, an investigation that Adriana had personally initiated that morning and assigned to an external review officer from the state attorney's office, a woman named Barbara Fitch, who had a reputation for completing investigations with a thoroughness that made the people being investigated deeply uncomfortable and the people requesting the investigations deeply reassured. By 4 p.m., Carol Voss's story was live on the Tribune's website under the headline, "New Police Chief Assaulted by Own Officers Before First Day Even Begins." And the photographs that ran with it were not ambiguous in any direction they showed in the clear and unforgiving quality of November morning light. A woman in a charcoal blazer with her face pressed against a police cruiser hood, and they showed the moment she straightened and placed a document on the hood, and they showed Brett Langley's face as he read what the document said, and that face captured in perfect natural light with the kind of focus that only a journalist who has been waiting for 45 minutes with a long lens can achieve, told a complete story without any caption. The story was shared 41,000 times in the first 6 hours, and by the time the evening news aired, it had reached national outlets with the specific velocity of a story that touches something people have been waiting for language to describe, and MSNBC ran a segment, and CNN assembled a panel, and the department's public affairs officer who had been hired by Holloway and was loyal to Holloway, and was at that precise moment sitting in her car in the parking structure 1 block away, frantically and unsuccessfully, trying to reach Holloway by phone, released a statement that used the word miscommunication and the phrase no means of verifying credentials in consecutive sentences. And Adriana read the statement, and she did not comment on it, and she was not in her office when she read it, because she was in the basement of the building, standing in the entrance of a room that most of the department's officers did not know existed. The annex evidence room was on sub-level 2 behind a door that required physical keys that Grant Holloway had kept in his personal possession for the entirety of his interim tenure, and the existence of this room was something that the department's formal organizational structure described as a secondary secure storage facility, and that Holloway had treated as something closer to a private archive accessible to the specific people whose cooperation he required, and invisible to everyone else. Adriana knew about the annex because Paul Denton had told her, and she had a copy of the key because Denton had quietly and carefully had one made 3 weeks earlier, and she went there that first afternoon with Barbara Fitch and Denton himself, and what they found in the first 3 hours of examination was the kind of thing that makes investigators go quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they realize the problem is larger than the investigation that brought them to it. 17 cases with improperly stored, mislabeled, or in 4 instances, physically removed evidence gone from the chain of custody without documentation, without authorization, without any record of removal that could survive scrutiny. And 3 of those cases involved officers whose names appeared with notable frequency throughout Simone Adeyemi's civil litigation file, and 2 of those cases were criminal prosecutions in which the defendant had been convicted and was currently serving a sentence. 2 people were in prison, and the evidence that had helped put them there had been touched by hands that had no business touching it, and the people whose hands those were had been operating inside a department whose leadership had looked in the other direction, and the direction they had been looking in was the direction of their own continued comfort and authority. And it had worked, and it had worked for years. Until the morning a woman in a charcoal blazer had been grabbed in a parking lot and had counted to 3. Barbara Fitch set down her clipboard, and she picked up her phone, and she made a call that she described only as unavoidable. And the way she said the word unavoidable suggested that she had been hoping somewhere in the professional part of herself that always hopes that it would not come to this, and that the hoping had been overruled by what was in front of her. Pruitt's cruiser had been parked 18 feet from the location of the incident, and its camera had been running, and the camera had captured 12 minutes of footage that included a conversation between Langley and Pruitt that had taken place 14 minutes before Adriana walked across the parking lot, and the conversation which Barbara Fitch obtained as part of the broader evidence sweep and which would later be played in full at a disciplinary hearing attended by lawyers and journalists, and 3 members of the city council, began with Langley saying in the casual voice of a man discussing something he has done enough times that it requires no special register. Holloway says she's coming in this morning, says she won't have her department card yet. Says if she shows up before she can show official credentials, we handle it the normal way and write it up after. Pruitt had said, "What if she's got paperwork?" Langley had said, "Paperwork isn't credentials. We've got about 30 seconds before anyone comes out of the building, long as she doesn't make a scene." What followed was 2 more minutes of conversation and 4 additional statements that, when read aloud in the disciplinary hearing, produced the specific silence of a room in which something irreversible has just been confirmed out loud, and that silence was the silence of an ending. The ending of the story that Langley and Pruitt and Holloway had been telling themselves about who they were and what they were authorized to do. A story that had run for years without interruption, and that had ended finally because a woman in a parking lot had decided to let them show themselves completely and had been ready long before that morning to make certain that what they showed was recorded. Brett Langley spent the 3 weeks following the parking lot being publicly loud, in the way that men who have been caught doing something indefensible sometimes become loud as if volume could retroactively change the nature of what has been documented. And he gave an interview to a local conservative radio host in which he described the incident as a training scenario that had been handled imperfectly, and suggested with a boldness that the host seemed to find impressive, and that attorneys watching at home found genuinely alarming that Adriana had not properly identified herself in a timely manner, which was a claim that the parking lot cameras had refuted in the first 10 seconds of footage. His attorney, Mark Devon, issued a formal statement calling the use of force investigation politically motivated targeting of dedicated officers by a new administration, seeking to make an example before understanding the culture it has inherited, which was a sentence that contained several words that were individually true and collectively dishonest, and which was designed for an audience that would read the statement in a headline and not follow the evidence. The Harlow City Police Union, Local 38, led by Steve Garner, who had the silver hair and camera-ready composure of a man who had been doing media appearances for decades and had never done one about something. He could not spin, backed Langley loudly and publicly, and called for a city council review of Adriana's appointment, framing the review request in the language of due process in a way that was designed to make accountability look like persecution, and for approximately 2 weeks it worked on the portion of the local media that wanted it to work. What none of them knew, not Langley, not his attorney, not Garner, not the radio host who had given Langley a sympathetic hour of airtime, was that Pruitt's dashcam footage existed, and that Barbara Fitch had it, and that every public statement they made was being added to a file that was growing more complete with each new statement. Adriana did not respond to any of it, and she did not instruct anyone on her behalf to respond to any of it. And when reporters asked her office for comment, she issued a single sentence saying that the investigation was proceeding and that she had nothing to add, and she meant both parts of that sentence equally. The hearing was held on November 19th in a room that had been reserved for command staff meetings and that had, in the weeks since Adriana's arrival, been used for exactly that purpose, which was a change that several veterans of the department had noted and not yet fully processed. The hearing officer was a retired state judge named Helen Brooke, who was 67 years old and had a reputation for 2 things: exceptional patience and an absolute refusal to allow procedural maneuvering to substitute for substantive engagement, and both of those qualities were in evidence before the hearing was 10 minutes old. Mark Devon made 3 motions in the first 15 minutes. The first challenging the composition of the hearing panel, the second challenging the chain of custody of certain evidence, and the third challenging the admissibility of footage from Pruitt's dash cam, on the grounds that it had been obtained outside normal evidence procedures, and Helen Brooke denied all 3 in succession with the calm efficiency of a person who has seen exactly these motions in exactly this order many times before, and has long since worked out the appropriate responses. The dash cam audio was played in full, and the room was still during the playback with the specific stillness of a group of people who are hearing something that removes all remaining ambiguity from a situation they had been hoping contained some, and when the audio finished, the voice of Brett Langley saying, "We handle it the normal way," and "write it up after," sat in the room for a moment in the silence that followed it. And that moment was the last version of the official story, the miscommunication story, the credentials story, the story that had been running in press releases and union statements for 3 weeks, came to its complete and final end. Langley was terminated at 2:47 p.m. Pruitt was terminated 35 minutes later, his case carrying an additional finding tied to the falsified incident report in the Jalen Ross case 3 years earlier, a falsification that Paul Denton's recordings had established with the kind of specificity that leaves no interpretive room. Langley had been 31 days from vesting his full pension. He walked out of the hearing room without it. Steve Garner, the union president who had spent 3 weeks on local radio calling Adriana a political operative with no respect for the officers she commanded, issued a 1-paragraph statement saying that the union was reviewing the findings and had no further comment. And the statement was so brief that it communicated in its brevity everything that a longer statement would have needed to conceal, and Garner did not appear in public or accept media requests for 10 days following. 6 weeks after the parking lot, Adriana's assistant knocked on her office door at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon and said that a woman named Keisha Monroe had been waiting and was requesting a few minutes, and Adriana's assistant had scheduled it as a routine constituent meeting because that was what it had been described as in the request, and it was not routine. Keisha Monroe sat across from Adriana's desk with the posture of a woman who has been rehearsing something and is not certain the rehearsal was adequate. And she said that she worked in records on the 3rd floor, and that she had been in the parking lot on the morning of November 4th, and she had seen what happened, and she had not gotten out of the car, and she had been carrying the weight of that every day since, and she wanted Adriana to know that she was sorry. Adriana said that she appreciated her coming, and she meant it, and Keisha nodded, and then she said the thing she had actually come to say, which was that her daughter had not stopped asking about the woman from the parking lot, and she asked whether the woman was okay and whether the officers had gotten in trouble, and she kept asking why no one had helped her. Adriana asked how old her daughter was. 9, Keisha said. Her name is Nadia. Adriana was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she would very much like to meet Nadia, and that if Keisha was agreeable, Nadia could come in for a visit, not a program, not a presentation, just a visit, so that she could see for herself that someone in this building was doing things the right way, and that the answer to her question about what happened to the officers was the answer that questions like that deserve. The expression that moved across Keisha Monroe's face in the moment that followed was the expression of a mother who has been trying for 6 weeks to explain something about the world to her child that does not have a good explanation, and who has just been handed something true to say instead. And it was the kind of expression that Adriana would remember for a very long time, longer than the parking lot, longer than the hearing room, longer than the national coverage. The specific relief of a person who had been waiting for the world to make a kind of sense that does not come easily, and has finally in this office on this Tuesday afternoon found it. The FBI investigation that had been quietly briefed in October became formally opened in early December, and Grant Holloway was placed on administrative leave on December 8th, and the charges that were filed against him 3 months later, civil rights conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and financial fraud related to the misclassified settlement payments, were not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are dramatic. They were procedural and dense and required careful reading, which is exactly what real accountability looks like when it is not performing itself for an audience. The Annex Evidence Review identified 2 men who had been wrongfully convicted, Terrence Banks and Damon Fields, and both of their cases were reopened. And on a cold morning in December, Terrence Banks walked out of Harlow City Correctional with his teenage daughter, walking beside him. She had been 7 years old when he went in and was now 15, and she had spent 8 years of her childhood visiting a man through glass, and now she was walking in the open air beside him, and reporters were waiting, and Terrence looked at the cameras and said very quietly, "I just want to go home." And the footage ran on every major network that night and was watched by more than 12 million people by the following morning. Adriana watched it from her office alone after most of the building had cleared out for the evening, and she did not allow herself or anyone around her to mistake it for the end of anything, because she had been doing this work long enough to know that drama. The parking lot, the hearing room, The footage of Terrence walking out into the cold was not the same thing as progress, and that progress was slower and quieter, and required showing up to the same unglamorous work on the Tuesday after a victory that you showed up to on the Monday before one, and that no headline had ever accurately captured what that actually cost. She restructured the Internal Affairs Unit, entirely separating it from command oversight and placing it under a direct line to her office alone, so that the specific arrangement that had allowed misconduct to be reviewed by the people who had authorized it could not quietly reconstitute itself when attention moved elsewhere. Because attention always moves elsewhere eventually, and the only thing that matters when it does is whether the structure you built is still standing. She implemented body camera requirements so specific about activation conditions that there were almost no interpretive spaces left, and when officers asked her why she was being so precise, she said the same thing every time. Because the spaces where interpretation lives are the spaces where abuse hides. On a Thursday afternoon in late January, there was a knock on Adriana's office door, and she said, "Come in." And the door opened, and Jalen Ross came through it slowly, using the cane that he had been using since the surgery on his kidney. The surgery he had needed because Brett Langley had stopped him on Mercer Street 3 years ago for a broken taillight. He was 26 years old, and he had lost his job during his recovery, and he had spent 18 months putting himself back together around the parts of himself that would not fully heal. And he had done it with the specific dignity of a person who has decided that what was done to him does not get to be the most important thing about who he is, even though it has permanently changed how he moves through the world. He sat across from her desk and looked at her with an expression that held a long and complicated history inside it. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but something that occupied the territory between them, and had been living there for 3 years, and was only now in this room being given somewhere to stand. He said, "I don't need an apology from the department. I've had apologies. What I need to know is whether it's going to happen to somebody else." Adriana held his eyes, and she did not reach for the kind of institutional language designed to sound like a promise while committing to nothing, and she said that she could not give him the future, but she could show him the work, and she could promise that her door would stay open to him, and that was a promise she intended to keep. He nodded, not the nod of a man who has been satisfied, but the nod of a man who has learned to measure trust in increments small enough to hold without breaking, and 2 months later without a speech and without fanfare. Jalen Ross showed up to the first meeting of the Community Advisory Board and took a seat at the table, and he came back the following month and the month after that. Brett Langley lost his certification, his pension, his union appeal, and eventually his county. He moved away the following spring after being turned down by every security and law enforcement adjacent firm that ran a background check on him, which was all of them. Dale Pruitt retained a criminal defense attorney and faces an ongoing federal investigation. His certification has been revoked and he has made no public statements. Grant Holloway entered a not guilty plea to federal charges and retained a high-profile defense team. His trial date was set for the following autumn, and the professional networks he had spent 30 years cultivating went quiet around him in the specific way of people who have decided that association is now a liability. Steve Garner resigned his union presidency in February. His successor reached out to Adriana's office within 2 weeks about building a cooperative accountability framework, something that would have been considered an impossible conversation 12 months earlier. Terrence Banks is living with his daughter and her family on the east side of Harlow City. He says the strangest thing about being free is the quiet. Damon Fields moved back to his mother's house, found work, goes to church on Sundays, and does not speak to reporters. Jalen Ross is studying for his paralegal certification and still uses the cane. Paul Denton was not publicly named as a cooperating witness until the federal charges were filed. He attended Terrence's first Christmas out of prison uninvited and unannounced, and stood at the back without approaching anyone, until Jalen's mother, who knew exactly who he was, because Simone had told her, walked across the room and took both of his hands in hers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. And that was enough. 8 months after her first day, Adriana Cole pulls into the executive parking space near the front entrance of Harlow City PD headquarters. The space that has her name on a sign, now a small white sign that someone in facilities put up without being asked, which she noticed and did not comment on, and she carries the same leather briefcase, and her badge is on her belt where it was always going to be. Nadia Monroe visited the department the previous Tuesday and sat in Adriana's chair and asked if the chief got to choose her own pens, and Adriana said yes, and Nadia chose a red one and drew something on a notepad and left it on the desk, and Adriana has not moved it. She walks through the front door, and Corporal Eddie Voss looks up from the desk he has worked for 14 years, and he says, "Morning, Chief," and she says, "Morning, Eddie," and she means every word of it, and she walks to the elevator and begins. If this story moved something in you, if you felt the weight of what it costs to stay calm, when the world is designed to make you break, share it, because there are people who need to know that preparation is not luck, that composure is not weakness, and that the woman with her face against that cruiser hood was already going to win. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us for more stories about the people who show up anyway.